Hi, everybody. We have a very full house today. We're looking forward to a lot of people joining on this interesting topic. Very timely being here in July and enjoying the beautiful weather. The lack of rain is not helping my lawn, but it is helping those that are out there cottage boating, for sure. We're going to let a bunch of people sign in. We do have a large list of people expected, so we're going to give them a moment to sign in and join. And in the meantime, while we're thinking about succession planning for your cottage, I'm going to ask people to put in the chat, as a practice for asking questions, put in chat, what's your favorite song to play at the cottage? Is it Freebird? Isn't it Fortunate Son by CCR? Is it gangster rap? What do people like? Eric, what's your favorite song?
Anything by the Tragically Hip usually goes, or Danger Zone by Top Gun soundtrack is also often played up at our place. So depends on the mood, if it's morning and volleyball time or if it's campfire time.
Keith, what's your favorite cottage?
Well, I think when you're at the cottage, you go sort of old school rock and roll. So I'm listening to sort of old stuff at the cottage, even some Elvis Presley, the Beatles, stuff like that. Go way back.
That's pretty good.
Are you going AM radio or are you
I don't know if I'm ready to go there. don't know if I'm ready to go there.
We want that bad quality. Come on.
The dock.
But I usually like to listen to some Southern rock at the cottage. It's usually pretty good. Sweet Home Alabama,
Nice.
CCR, some Lynyrd Skynyrd, Eagles, that kind of thing. I don't know. Somehow for me it just fits in. There's actually a playlist on Spotify called Yacht Rock.
Oh, of course.
YACHT rock, and it's all kind of that kind of stuff, and it somehow just fits in with sipping your favorite beverage by the dock and watching the waves. So we're gonna show. So that's fun. We didn't get much in the chat there. If anyone wants to put in the chat what your favorite song. Oh, Beach Boys. There we go. There's one.
Oh.
If anyone wants to put in the chat what your favorite music is to listen to at the cottage, we'd be keen, and we'll be reminding you to put that in later again. Not for any purpose other than we're curious. Christy really likes to listen to the 80s stuff. So Christy will be cranking out the Depeche Mode and Paula Abdul at the cottage, it sounds like.
Duran.
Yeah, Duran. Janet likes the 70 rocks. Oh yeah, here's Devendra likes Country Roads by John Denver. Can't go wrong with that.
On repeat.
Yeah.
Also, Patricia will also take 80s. So I'm assuming that's Wham and Howard Jones. That's all good too. But Ride Into the Danger Zone is an 80s song as well, Eric. So there you go.
Correct.
Yeah.
Topical.
Bit of Bryan Adams, can't go wrong either. This is our team. So now we've exposed our music tastes. Jeff apparently really likes the Top Gun soundtrack. Myself, I like 70s rock at the cottage. Eric likes a variety of things, I'm sure, mostly Tragically Hip. Ose, we don't know. Leia likes Beach Boys and Cat Empire. Cat Empire, that's an Australian band, I think. So that is an esoteric pick, but well done. Today we have Keith speaking with us. He likes the Elvis Presley at the cottage. Keith is vice president at CI Global Asset Management, a sister company to Asante. And he deals with tax, retirement, estate planning. We've had Keith speak to our group before, and as we all know, Keith is an amazing presenter, fun to listen to, and knows his stuff. So then we'll get to questions at the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now, and I'm going to let Keith share his screen with the actual meat of the presentation, and we're going to rock and roll, go forward.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much. Interesting to hear everyone's musical taste. I might change my mind partway through as you caught me off guard. But at any rate, I wanted to talk today a little bit about succession planning in the family cottage. I've been a lawyer for, 34, 35 years, something like that, maybe a little longer than that. And in that time period, I've helped hundreds of families with succession planning, estate administration, and when things go wrong, of course, estate litigation. And I've always told people that in my entire profession, which has all been estate related, that my entire job, the only job I have really, is to make sure that your family can still have Christmas dinner together after you pass away, or still have dinner together after you pass away. And that's harder than it sounds, particularly when you have a cottage as part of your estate plan. And it's harder than it sounds because you've got an asset with tremendous economic value, tremendous emotional value, and also probably a pretty large tax bill when it transfers from one generation to the other. And also kind of an unfair tax bill, because quite often the tax bill lands on the shoulders of a party who doesn't even get ownership of the cottage. Also, a lot of emotions take over, because a cottage, more than anything else, I think, is an asset with a lot of emotion. And then there's a lot of fractured families and increased costs. And there was a case that came across my desk about 4 or 5 months ago that I thought was kind of interesting, and I thought I'd bring it up to you guys because I think it shows how families can sort of fight over these things. And that case was the case of Canada Trust and Ross. And in that particular case, we had a family who basically disagreed with what should happen to a cottage in an estate. So there was an estate, a lady had died, she'd owned a cottage, and a family began to fight about what should happen with that cottage. So the family went to court, and the family fought, and they fought, and they fought. And along the lines of fighting, they spent so much in legal fees and administrative fees that the cottage eventually had to be sold. At the time the cottage was sold, it was worth $1.138 million. So $1.2 million basically in round numbers. By the time it went to the Court of Appeal and it eventually got settled, or eventually heard a judgment, decided who was going to get this thing, there was only $340,000 left in the account. And so the bottom line was some money had gone to the family, but an awful lot of money went to expenses, went to lawyers. There was, what, a 7 or 8 year delay in anyone getting anything. And nobody actually got the cottage. It eventually had to be sold. So everyone lost. And that's an example, I think, of the tremendous emotion that comes with succession planning in a cottage. So
what I get from that, Keith, is we should all tell our kids to become lawyers that help settle family disputes, because you'll get.
I don't know. You know the old expression about a town that's too small to support one lawyer can always support two. They'll fight amongst themselves. So I don't know if that's a good idea.
Right.
But at any rate, what are we going to talk about today, I guess, is the big question. And I think of cottage succession as sort of a walk down a country road. And in that walk down that country road, there's a series of forks. And every single one of those forks requires the owner of the cottage and the family of the owner of the cottage to make a decision and think about things. So today we're going to walk down those forks. And really in our walk today, there are 4 basic forks. The first one is defining the objectives. If you will, what are the fundamentals that the owner is trying to achieve? And what are those, what's that roadmap look like? So it's sort of a plan that you come back to every so often and say, these were the fundamentals that I said were important. The second fork is kind of looking at the future and having an eye on the future and saying, what is important? What are the wants for the owner of the cottage, and what are the wants of the next generation? Can they share a cottage if they decide to gift it to each other? What exactly are we looking at from the desires and the wants of the family? The third fork, of course, is understanding the options, including the tax options. And there are usually 3 options when you're talking about transfer: selling the cottage to either a family member or to a third party, gifting the cottage to a family member, or holding onto the cottage and transferring it as part of your estate plan. So we're going to look at those 3 options. And then the fourth fork is the legal complexities. Some of the issues you have to think about when you're transferring the cottage, particularly or almost solely when you're transferring it within the family. So those are the forks we're going to look at. Then we'll just do a little quick conclusion. So the first thing we're going to look at is, there's a lot of ground to cover, but let's talk about defining the objectives of the owner. It's impossible to determine the right path for a cottage owner without coming to an understanding of their primary objectives. So what exactly are they trying to achieve? Typically, these objectives include the following that you see on your screen. These are usually what clients tell you: keeping the transfer plan simple and cost efficient, keeping the property in the family, avoiding family conflict and being fair to all the children. Fair doesn't necessarily, by the way, mean equal. Avoiding family conflict as much as possible, minimizing tax payable, and protecting the property against creditors or other third parties. And some of these objectives are actually inconsistent, and some of them are kind of impractical. For instance, keeping planning simple and cost efficient may be very, very hard to achieve if the children are to be treated similarly, but only one is going to end up with a cottage. Secondly, having a plan that's simple and cost efficient can be very, very difficult when all the children are going to share the cottage, and we'll go through why in a few minutes. The second fork we're going to look at is casting an eye to the future and really getting to know the needs of the current owner and the next generation. In some ways, this requires kind of a crystal ball to determine where the various parties may be in the future. It often requires two conversations, or I think it always involves two conversations. One between the current owners and usually their advisors, and the second one is bringing the entire family in and talking to the entire family about the planning. So let's talk first about the conversation with the current owner. The current owner is often faced with the question of whether they'll gift the cottage to the next generation, retain it, or sell it to the next generation, or sell it to a third party. If the owner decides to gift it, does he or she want to do so now, to see the kids enjoy the property as part of their estate plan, or transfer it as part of their estate plan in the future? When do they want to transfer the cottage? Before they decide, they need to determine if they may require the cottage's equity down the road to fund their retirement. And that's where an advisor can help to determine the retirement income needs, including unanticipated costs such as the medical costs and housing costs. Are you going to need the equity in the future before you start thinking about transferring it to the next generation or what to do with it? On the other hand, a lot of people say transferring the cottage now is going to free up retirement income because it gets rid of a whole pile of expenses. So if they looked at those expenses and determined, does that make retirement a little nicer if I actually transfer the cottage now, even if I'm just giving it? Another topic for this conversation is to determine how the owner wants to deal with his or her children. Treating children fairly doesn't necessarily mean treating them the same. The cottage can be left to one child or gifted to one child, and the other children can be paid a cash legacy. However, the problem with that, especially in an estate plan, is the cottage value will fluctuate at a different amount as your hard assets or as your liquid assets. And therefore, if you're going to transfer the cottage to one child, are you satisfied that the other children may receive a different amount through their legacy, and how do you deal with that? The next conversation is with the entire family. And I can tell you from experience, from personal experience, these conversations can be very, very difficult and emotional, but in the long run, I think are very, very valuable if you're going to transfer a cottage to the next generation. And I think some topics for these conversations are to first find out if all the children are interested in the cottage. Quite often what I find is that someone says, I'm going to transfer the cottage to both my children, and they've never had that conversation to determine if both children are really interested in the cottage or whether one would rather have the cash. Many families are like mine. I have a sister who lives in Vancouver, but my brother and my other sister live within an easy drive of where I am right now. My sister in Vancouver, we had this conversation, had no interest whatsoever in a cottage that was located in Ontario. She would never get to it. Another topic for this conversation with the entire family is to ask whether those who are interested in the cottage are fully cognizant of the costs associated with it, with the upkeep and the work involved in maintaining it. In other words, can they afford it? Again, I'm going to come back to my family. Most families, I think, are like mine. My siblings and I have very different financial means. Some of us could probably afford a cottage, other of us couldn't afford a cottage, but it was important to lay out those costs and talk about it before we suddenly started transferring the cottage. How does the owner see their future in the cottage? If it's the intention to gift it to the next generation prior to death, so gift it now, which is a great opportunity to see your next generation enjoy the cottage. Does the current owner believe that they'll still be able to use the cottage whenever they want to? Can they come and go and treat it more or less as if it's still their cottage, even though now ownership is in a different someone else's hands? I can think of one example right off the top of my head. I can probably think of countless of them, but I can think of one example where a cottage was transferred to the eldest son of a family. The parents, the original owners, continued to use the cottage whenever they felt like it. Well, about 5 years after the cottage was transferred, the son remarried for the second time. His new wife took great exception to her in-laws always being at the cottage. She didn't particularly like her in-laws. It was kind of a messy divorce from his first wife and marriage to his second wife. And she saw this as her cottage. She married the owner. The result was there was a huge family fight. The parents no longer spoke to their son and no longer used the cottage at all. So I think in quite often situations where you're saying, I want to use the cottage in the future, I'm transferring it now, but I want to make sure I can continue to use it. It's really important that you guarantee that right somewhere. Either you come to an agreement between you and your children that says you have the right to use the cottage, or you actually carve out a life interest and put it right on the registered deed transferring it, that I have the right to use the cottage for the remainder of my life. Some other things to speak about when you're talking with that next generation. If more than one child is interested in the cottage and they can afford it, there's an awful lot of topics they have to discuss. And here's a few of them. Who gets the final say on future development of the property once it's transferred to the next generation? Is the cottage supposed to stay as a small, quaint property, or will the bunkies be added and additions added to accommodate new family members? Because families are going to increase in size. Are there too many beneficiaries to realistically share the cottage? You know, again, coming back to my family, there's 4 of us, but I think my dad has 12 grandchildren and 11 great-grandchildren. The family tree expands out. What happens to a cottage when there's simply too many beneficiaries? Do the children get along well enough to share a cottage? Can they actually make decisions together, or are they slightly estranged? If not all the children are interested in the cottage, how are we going to equalize, or is equalizing important? Finally, has the family considered whether it's possible to sever the cottage lot into numerous lots to accommodate the family at different levels? Some other things to consider that should be discussed.
One thing, one quick question here, and we'll come back to the second part of this question. The first question, when we're saying transferring the cottage prior to the parents passing or the owner's passing, we mean, are we meaning sold or gifted or both?
Well, we'll get to that, but I mean, you can sell the cottage to the next generation, or you can gift the cottage to the next generation. You're right. So when I'm looking at this, the importance of the conversation about how are we going to manage the cottage is important regardless of which one of those you're doing, if more than one child is interested in the cottage.
Great. And then we're going to get into later as well, Patricia, we'll get into all the fun tax consequences of all the choices with.
I'm afraid so. I'm afraid there's a lot of tax consequences, and we're going to have to talk about all of it.
That's why tax is the first part in the name of your group, tax.
There you go. That's right. Exactly. I wish it wasn't the first name in our group, because you'd be amazed how many times people leave us notes saying, I was trying to Google Trump and I misspelt it and it came out Trep and they got us. So there you go. Anyway, but here's some more things that you've got to decide at that early stage with the family, at that tremendously important early stage. Let's see, where were we talking? Who will have the right to use the cottage and when? Does each branch envision time at the cottage by themselves, or is your cottage sort of a Kennedy-like compound where everyone's going to be there at the exact same time? That was kind of a killer issue in my family. I can tell you that right now, where some of us said, love the entire family, but I want my period at the cottage just to be my wife and children and myself. And someone else was saying, well, I'm going to always be there for the entire summer. It's a family cottage. Who performs the maintenance and hires the contractors? Can one person agree on approve all estimates, or does everyone have to agree when it's time to hire a contractor? Who gets the call when the roof is leaking or the septic system breaks up at 3 o'clock in the morning? Who's involved in all those things? What happens in the case of a dispute if one branch wishes to be bought out? Can they? If so, how? Can they sell their interest to a third party, or do they have to sell it within the family? What about cleanliness standards? My family, I'm sure, have different cleanliness standards. I'm sure your children have different cleanliness standards. What is the standard being kept in the cottage? What about the use of the cottage by future generations? Can a teenage grandson have a wild party there on a Friday night? Or let's say a teenage grandson or great-grandson or someone like that ends up finding a summer job near the cottage. Can they spend the entire summer there? Is that all right with the other family members? At what point are there too many interested parties to share and it simply becomes untenable for your family to share? Once all those issues are discussed and they come to an understanding about it, I think it's tremendously important that they draft a co-ownership agreement with a lawyer. It's expensive, and when we talked about those fundamental principles, one of them is keeping it simple. You might not be doing that, but I think it's so tremendously important to set out an agreement. This in many ways is a contract of a business arrangement and should be treated as such. But as Per was saying, we have to go on and understand the options of transfer and the tax implications of doing all three. So once we've come to a conclusion of whether the family is even interested in the cottage, and if more than one person is interested in the cottage, how many people are interested in the cottage, it's time to talk about the transfer options available to the owner. And today we're going to basically talk about three of them. The first one is selling the cottage to a family member or to a third party. Secondly is gifting the cottage to family members during my lifetime. I want to make sure that the family enjoys it, so I'm going to transfer it now to watch them enjoy it. And the last one is transferring the cottage as part of my estate plan, setting out the transfer in my will. So let's start with selling the cottage to a third party or family member. I think this is usually the most straightforward option, as it minimizes some of those personal and emotional issues. It just transfers the cottage away. However, with all transfers, including gifting, it's important to understand the taxes that will be generated. When the cottage is sold to a family member, a third party, or gifted, the cottage is a capital asset and is taxed as one. When the cottage is sold, any capital gains needs to be reported on the tax return of the original owner or the transferor in the year of the sale. To do so, two values are required to calculate the gain. First, the fair market value, the value of the property today, and the adjusted cost base. Subtracting the adjusted cost base from the fair market value will leave you what your net capital gain is for tax purposes. The adjusted cost base, in very, very loose terms, and this is going to become a little more complicated, but in very, very loose terms as we start, is the original value of the cottage when the owner took ownership of it. So let's do a really, really quick example. If the cottage was originally valued at $200,000 when the owner received it, either he inherited it or he bought it, however he received it, it was worth $200,000. And it's now worth $1.5 million. The taxable capital gain is $1.3 million. The fair market value less the ACB, the original cost of the cottage. Half of which, about $750,000, would be a taxable capital gain. In Ontario, the highest marginal, the capital gain is $1.3 million. Half of it, $750,000, is the taxable capital gain. In Ontario, the highest marginal rate for income taxes is 53.53%. So the corresponding tax payable will be about $330,000 when that cottage sells. I said a minute ago that the calculation is a little more complex than simply taking what I bought it at and what I sold it at and subtracting. And that's because there are four factors that have to be considered when calculating that gain. The first is the owner has to keep track of all the capital improvements made to the cottage over the years and keep those receipts. And I'll tell you why it's important to keep those receipts in a minute. The cost of capital improvements, as opposed to maintenance, but capital improvements would be things like fixing the deck, installing a new water system, things like that. The cost of those can be added to the adjusted cost base, to the ACB, which can reduce the taxable capital gain. As the ACB goes up, the gain becomes less. Why it's important to keep those receipts is CRA has made a statement stating that they will be looking for these transfers and they will be auditing them. And so they're going to be saying, if you're looking at your ACB, prove your ACB, let's see what your cost base was and what capital improvements you've added to the original cost. The second factor that I wanted to say that complicates that calculation in a way is that before 1972, there were no capital gains in Canada. So when transferring a cottage bought in 1971 or earlier, a valuation as of December 31st, 1971 must be obtained. Any gain before that is not taxable, so you don't have to worry about it. So the ACB changes a little bit because now it's 1971. Thirdly, prior to February of 1994, there was a $100,000 capital gain exemption available to shelter gains on certain properties, which included cottages. Before repealing that exemption, CRA allowed Canadians to make an election on their 1994 tax returns to bump up the ACB of some of those assets by $100,000. It's been my experience that most people don't remember whether they took the bump up in 1994 especially when you're dealing with estates. No one has any idea. And so that 1994 tax return has to be reviewed to see if they bumped up the ACB of the cottage by that $100,000 in that particular year. It can save a lot of tax now. But perhaps the most important factor to consider when looking at the calculation of that capital gain is the principal residence exemption. So the gain may be reduced or eliminated by application of the principal residence exemption. A property will qualify as a principal residence. This is the definition in the Income Tax Act. If the taxpayer's spouse or common law partner, or any of the taxpayer's children lived in that residence at some point during the year. It doesn't have to be continuous residence. So the principal residence exemption is typically used on your house, but it can be used on the sale of a cottage as well. Effectively, what the exemption means is that when a property is sold, which is designated as a principal residence, and you don't make that designation until when you sell it, it passes on a tax-free basis without tax on the gain. However, since December 31st, 1981, a taxpayer and their spouse can only have one principal residence between the two of them at any particular time. Nothing says that the principal residence, as we said, must be your main residence. It can, in many situations, it makes more sense to have it your cottage, but couples can only have one. Prior to that date, so prior to December 31st, 1981, everyone could have one principal residence. So a couple, in effect, could have two principal residences and protect both the cottage and the house's capital gain when they sold it. For each year after 1981, the couple would be required to designate one of the properties as a principal residence, claimable when it's sold at death or when it's sold. So in addition to those values we talked earlier, that 1972 value and the 1994 value and the 1981 value, for married couples who own property prior to 1982, a valuation as of December 31st, 1981 will be needed because they can protect both properties prior to that. Also, another thing to remember about the principal residence exemption is if you have a property that is situated on a large lot over half a hectare, the taxpayer must be able to establish that any land over a half hectare is actually necessary for the use and enjoyment of the property. Remember, use and enjoyment is part of the definition of a principal residence. So what they're basically saying is, if you have this huge cottage property and it's acres and acres, you have to prove the property over a half hectare was actually used for the use and enjoyment of a principal residence, or you don't get the principal residence exemption on that portion of it. This half hectare rule is more complicated than you might think. In 2011, the tax court heard the case of Cassidy versus the Queen. In that particular case, Mr. Cassidy sold his property, or transferred his property in actual fact, and the property was 2.43 hectares, so more than that half hectare. He claimed the principal residence exemption on the entire thing. And his argument was that I can't subdivide the property. You know, it's not that we were constantly on the entire 2.43 hectares, but I can't sever it. So it must be necessary for the use and enjoyment of the property because it is part of the property. I can't get rid of it. The tax court bought his argument and said, okay, we can understand that if severance is impossible, we're going to have to treat this as one big property. However, they said, you know, we have to look at every single year of your ownership and determine whether severance was ever an option. Because if it was an option, we disagree with your interpretation. So they said for a certain period of time, the entire thing was a principal residence. But at some point, the rules changed in that particular jurisdiction and allowed severance. So after that particular period, the principal residence designation on the property bigger than half hectare was not available to them. One thing that you'll notice is we talked about valuations of a lot of time periods. We talked about valuation in 1981 and 1972 and all these different valuation periods. And you might wonder how you come up with that value. And I can tell you again from experience dealing with an awful lot of families, those values are very, very hard to determine. You have to hire an accountant who's willing to try and do a historic valuation of the property on that particular day. And those can get very, very expensive to do. It's possible
Can I? Your point about valuations is a very valid one, in fact, because someone has to make a determination. And if you can't, I'm sure CRA has a challenge doing it. Secondly, I've learned that the properties don't have to be in Canada to be considered principal residences.
That's very true.
Yeah. And thirdly, you can have a designation of principal residence for a period of time, which changes in a second period of time. So you can say designate your cottage was your principal residence from 1980 to 2007, and then from 2008 forward, it becomes another property. So there's opportunities to kind of play with the years to see how that works out from a valuation perspective.
Yeah, the designation is a year-by-year decision. Now, a lot of people get confused and think, well, does that mean every single year I have to designate what the cottage was? That's not what it means. It means that when you sell or transfer the property, you have to designate for every single year what it was. And you're right, Jeff. You can say, during this particular time period, I'm going to say my house was the principal residence. In this particular time period, I'm going to say my cottage was. Years and years ago, when I was young and charming, so it was quite a long time ago, I was involved with this family. And they had a cottage that was worth a ton of money. The family had sold their principal residence about 2 years before they died. And at that particular time, they used the principal residence exemption on the house. After the gentleman died who owned the cottage, we went back and we looked at the principal residence exemption for every single year and the value of the cottage versus the value of the house. And we determined that refiling his tax returns for the year he sold the house, even with the interest and penalties, because there will be interest and penalties, and only claiming the principal residence exemption for certain periods of that time and applying it to the cottage for certain periods of time, saved the family about $240,000 over and above the penalties and interest. So it's a complicated calculation, but it's one that you really need to get help with and find out a good appraiser to help you and a good accountant to help you, because it can make a tremendous difference, the application of the principal residence exemption.
So just to finish that thought, what is an acceptable form of valuation for a property if you're considering a sale? Would it be 3 real estate agents who give you an appraised value? Would it be comparative? I mean, how would you do it?
Well, I think there are 2, in my experience, and who knows, I mean, CRA could object to anything, I suppose, but in my experience, I haven't been questioned if you have a formal appraisal done by a registered appraiser, or if you have, as you said, 3 real estate appraisals done that more or less agree on the price. The problem with these historic appraisals is I don't find many real estate agents willing to put their neck on the line and say, this is what I think the property was worth in 1981. And therefore you have to go to an appraiser, and those can get very costly, because that's a lot of research, historic research for them to do.
Keith, we have 2 questions coming in hot, so this dialogue
look at this.
Great thoughts. So the first one, topical on Janet, was just wanted to clarify the understanding about being able to change the principal residence designation from year to year. She's asking, can this change from year to year? Janet, my understanding is that you can only have one property designated per year. So yes, it can change from year to year, but you can only designate that one property for the year. So it can't change. Anything to add on that, or is that?
Nope, I think you've nailed it. Yeah.
Perfect. So hopefully that clarifies. Janet, you can send us a note if there's anything else that you wanted to clarify. And then Craig was asking another question, Keith, with regards to the transferring of the ownership. We mentioned 3 ways, the gifting, the selling, and then via will. What about transferring by making the children joint tenants in common? Is that something that we touch upon, or can you offer?
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about joint tenancies if we get there when we talk about estate transfers.
Okay.
I think, quite frankly, without destroying my pater in this whole thing and going too far off script, I think it's probably one of the more important topics to talk about, because I think it's one of the more common things that people are doing is putting assets into joint name with the next generation. And I also think that when I look at my Ontario reports reporting lawsuits, and anything else, it's one of the areas where I see more litigation than most other areas. That doesn't mean every family blows up and has litigation, but it does mean that it has to be cautiously done, and you have to really think about what you're intending out of these things, because you might leave a situation where your family fights. The other thing I'll say about about joint tenancies, and it's true about transferring cottages too, but let's do it in the way of a joint tenancy. Part of the issue with transferring a property into joint name, and maybe I shouldn't be talking about this now, maybe I should wait, but we were talking about the principal residence exemption, is it might make a big difference to the principal residence exemption. And I'll give you an example. Suppose that I'm a dad. Don't have to suppose very far, I am. And suppose that I only have one property and it's my cottage. And suppose that I have a son, and my son has a house already. He has a house in the city, he's still raising his kids, and he's decided to keep a house in the city. Suppose that I put my cottage into joint name with my son. The issue is that in CRA's view, if this is a joint account with right of succession, and we'll get into that in a few minutes, CRA says, well, you've disposed of half the value of the cottage, and half of it now is owned, if you will, by your son. And that means that at the time I transferred the cottage to my son, I can use the principal residence exemption to avoid tax at that point. But now my son owns half of that property in CRA's view. And so when he sells or whatever else happens to him, he has to make an election. He's lost the principal residence exemption either on half the value of the cottage or on his house for the remainder of the time he owns both properties. Whereas if we just left it in my name and I eventually died, which apparently I'm going to do, but I eventually died, I could use the entire principal residence exemption to satisfy or protect the entire gain. So quite often people put it in joint name, and what they're doing is they're having an effect on the principal residence exemption. I think it's important to just point that out now. Moving on though, it's possible to spread the pain of the tax bill over a period of up to 5 years. By selling the cottage at fair market value and taking back a promissory note with terms that spread the requirements to pay over a 5-year time frame, the owner only has to include 1/5 every year of the gain on his or her tax returns. And using this tool has a lot of advantages. One thing, it's reducing the amount of capital gain every single year, and that can be tremendously important. Earlier, we mentioned that the highest marginal tax rate in Ontario is 53.53%. Well, using our old example before that we talked about, where the taxable capital gain was $750,000, it moves an awful lot of that capital gain under the highest marginal tax rate. So it might actually have an effect on a lower tax bracket, as well as meaning you can move the pain over the 5 years. The other thing to remember about this is the seller doesn't actually have to collect the proceeds. The note can be forgiven. Quite often they are in the wills saying, I forgive the note owing by my son for the cottage. And so although the tax will still will be owing, it means the strategy can be used when the property is gifted.
Keith, another, just coming back to the idea of quick questions while we were there.
Yep.
Come back to the idea of designating a different principal residence every year. I guess the question is, what type of documentation is needed to do that? And is that done via your tax return?
Yeah, it's done via your tax return. And I think the only problem you've had if you're constantly shifting over one from the other, and I've never seen anyone, change on a yearly basis or anything,
No.
But I think the only problem you'd have is the appraisal values. I've not seen CRA require any other documentation than just the election on your tax return.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Where were we now? Oh, yeah. Just a second. Okay, we talked about that. So sorry, I've gotten a little lost here for a second. As I said earlier, it's not just the sale of the cottage that will give rise to tax. If the owner decides to gift the cottage to the next generation, in CRA's eyes, the property was transferred at fair market value, and all those capital gain rules we just talked about would apply. So if I decide to take my cottage and transfer it to my son and daughter today, and I'm gifting to them for free, there you go, you guys can just have it because I love you. CRA says you might love them, but in our eyes, you sold it at fair market value, and all those tax rules we applied just talked about apply. And a lot of families say, well, is that fair? If I'm giving you the cottage, kids, is it really, really fair then I incur a tax liability because the tax is going to be payable by me. I'm the one who's transferred the cottage away. And a lot of families come to the idea that what they're going to do is they're going to come to an agreement that the children will reimburse that tax bill. Because after all, they're the ones who got a free cottage out of the whole thing. So they'll reimburse either part of the tax bill or the entire tax bill. Be very, very careful if you're going to do that, because you might incur some unpleasant results as a result of doing that. And the ones I'm going to talk about are two. A little bit of conversation about the land transfer tax in Ontario. So if a person buys land, they must pay land transfer tax in the province of Ontario when the field closes. Provincial land transfer tax is generally 1% to 2% of the value of the property. Land transfer tax is based on the value paid for the property, plus any liabilities like a mortgage that the new owner assumed of the property. So when property is transferred as a gift at zero cost, there is no land transfer tax because there was no consideration, there was no value paid for the property. However, CRA says that if the new owner, so in our theoretical example, my son says, Dad, I'll reimburse you for part of that tax liability, unfair, it falls on your shoulders. If the new owner pays any amount towards the transfer, part of the capital gains tax, the probate fees if this is an estate issue, whatever else there might be, CRA says it's considered part of the sales price and the land transfer will now be owing. So in our earlier example, by agreeing to reimburse their parents for the capital gains tax, the tax will now be incurred, a new tax will be incurred, which is that land transfer tax. Now it's not a huge tax, but it's still something to think about at the time you're doing that. Another consequence of transferring the cottage to a child is that quite often people are surprised to find that it changes the new owner, find that the new owner, so in my theoretical case, my son, has lost their status under the qualified first-time homebuyers program. And you talked about joint property in a minute, and this applies to joint property. Under the first-time homebuyers program, a qualified buyer may be eligible for a refund of all or part of the land transfer tax when they purchase their first home. But where a person acquires an interest in a property, no matter how small or how they acquired it, whether it was a gift or someone put property in joint name with them, that child loses any future entitlement under the first-time home buyers program for the reimbursement of land transfer tax or any other benefits under that program, because they are no longer considered a first-time home buyer. So transferring the cottage has certain ramifications that have to be reviewed down the line from those sort of taxes as well.
So Keith, just for clarity, can you, the land transfer tax is paid at the time the notary or the lawyer prepares the closing documents, and you said it's 1% to 2%. Why is it variable? And it's 1% to 2% of what? The combined price of the property, or what are costs in there?
So yes, it is payable at the time the property deed is registered by the lawyer. So at the time the transfer occurs. I used 1% to 2% because it depends on whether the house is in the area of metropolitan Toronto or outside of metropolitan Toronto, because metropolitan Toronto, and I think Hamilton, though I can't be certain about that, you guys might know, you're a little closer to Hamilton than me, have their own land transfer tax in addition to the provincial land transfer tax. So you have both of them that bumps it up in those two jurisdictions to closer to the 2 than the 1. So that's why I use the range, and I can't recall what your third, oh, and how's it calculated? It's calculated on the total value paid for the property. So if I pay nothing, if my dad says, here's a house, I don't pay land transfer tax. But if I reimburse him for a portion of the capital gains tax paid, so let's say I reimburse him $380,000, the tax agency says that $380,000 is now consideration paid for the property.
Right. So you're saying on a $1 million purchase, right? We're looking at $10,000 in land transfer.
Yeah, well, I don't think I'm exactly.
Give or take, for cottage country. So that would mean that the son owes the taxes plus the 10,000.
Right, that's what would happen.
Okay, all right,
So
okay.
it's not a massive amount, but it's something to take into consideration. And the other issue that we talked about a second ago was the first-time home buyers program. I think a lot of people lose the point that you have to look at what your children own now, because if they own property now, there's not as much of an issue. But if they don't own property now and you're putting assets in joint name, you might have ruined their chances for some relief under the first-time home ownership program.
And on the first-time home ownership, was there not a 5-year window there where after it resets every 5 years?
Yeah, you're right. There's that 5-year window. Is it 4?
4 years.
Eric's saying 4. I thought it was 5, but anyway. So now we're going to talk about estate plan. So given all that we've talked about today, the tax you're going to incur today if you transfer the cottage as a gift to your children and some of the other ramifications, it might be best to hold on to the cottage and transfer the cottage as part of your estate plan. And if you do that, there's 2 things you have to keep in mind. One, the cottage, if it transfers through your will, is going to incur a probate fee. As you guys know, because we've talked about this before, currently in the province of Ontario, probate fees are equal to about 1.5% of the value of all the assets passing through the estate, over and above the first $50,000 in assets. The first $50,000 is a freebie. So, for instance, if a cottage was worth $1.5 million, just quickly doing the math, it means the probate fee payable on death will be $21,750. A lot of people try and minimize probate by using a whole bunch of minimizing probate tools that we can talk about at some point if you want to try and reduce that fee as much as possible. The other reason people are now trying to minimize the value of their estate, and this is kind of an aside, is because the Ontario government last year came out with the new rules about small estates. And they said if the time of your death, your estate is worth $150,000 or less, so you almost have to have put your cottage and your house in joint name or in a trust or something else. You've got to take it out of your estate if you wanted to have that happen. Then your estate is now called a small estate. And the small estate applies for probate in a different way. Doesn't make a difference about the probate fees, but it applies for probate in a different way. And probate is guaranteed to be back in your hands in 5 days, as opposed to the regular probate process, which can be months and months and months and months. The second type of thing that you have to remember when you're transferring through your estate is those date of death taxes. The night before you die, you're deemed to have sold everything you own at fair market value. And all the registered products that you own, your RSPs and your RIFs, etc., 100 cents on the dollar is added to income the year you die. Capital gain of any non-registered accounts you have is added to income in the year you die. So in the year you die, you're going to have a huge income inclusion. And I think it's tremendously important to always plan around those. They're always tremendously important. However, when you're talking about a cottage, I think it increases the importance of those, because it's really important to talk about whether your estate has enough liquidity to pay those taxes. Because there's nothing worse than putting the right plan in place that says, you know what, in my estate, I'm going to leave this to my son, my daughter, to all my children, whoever it is, but then finding the estate doesn't have enough cash to pay those taxes that are going to come up. Because if you don't have enough money in the estate to pay those taxes, CRA is not going to just forgive it. They're going to say, well, you have to come up with it somewhere. And likely the place you're going to have to come up with it is you're going to have to sell the cottage, which completely destroys the entire purpose of your estate plan. The other thing to remember, I think, about those taxes is they are paid by the estate. So let's give a simple example. I leave my cottage to my son. So he's going to get the entire value of the cottage. And then I leave the remainder of my estate to my daughter, or to my son and daughter equally, however you want to do it. Well, before my son and daughter as beneficiaries of my estate get 1 nickel, all the taxes are going to have to be paid. So in our silly little example, my son gets the entire cottage free and clear, and my daughter, as one of the residual beneficiaries, gets the joy of paying the taxes on the transfer of his cottage, because that's an estate expense. Tremendously unfair, or so my daughter would tell you. It's tremendously unfair. And I think it's tremendously important to start looking at that and going, how can I deal with this tax in a different manner? What drafting should I put in my will to say, maybe the transfer of the cottage to my son, the tax on that will be removed from his share of the residual of the estate or some other planning. In order to mitigate these two taxes, people consider a whole bunch of options, which we talked about before. But the two I'm going to talk about now are creating an inter vivos trust, and then we're going to talk about transferring assets into joint name. So first, let's just talk about inter vivos trust, and I'll do this quickly because I think I'm going to get the hook in a few minutes from you guys. So creating an inter vivos trust, inter vivos simply means a trust I created while I was alive. There's trust that you can create in your will, or there's trust that you create while you're alive. We'll avoid probate. So if I create a trust today and I transfer all my belongings into it, and then I die, there is no probate fee because everything's in the trust. Now, that's not a really good idea in most trust situations because there's going to be a tax when I transfer the assets into the trust because it's deemed to be a disposition and it's transferred into the trust at fair market value. So I'm going to have to pay tax now to avoid a tax after I die. Maybe I'm a little selfish, but I don't think that's a really great idea. But there's one exception to that, and that's a joint partner or an alter ego trust. I think it was in 2015, maybe you guys can correct me, but I think it was around 2015, the budget created two types of trusts, a joint partner trust and an alter ego trust. And they said in that budget that if I create a trust and I'm over 65 years old, or my spouse is over 65 years old, one of us has to be over 65 years old, and we're Canadian residents. And during the time that I'm alive, I'm the only person, or in the case of a joint partner trust, I and my spouse are the only people who can benefit from that property during my life. Then the assets roll into the trust without any tax. There's a rollover. And when I die, there's no probate fees. Still going to be that date of death taxes on the date of the survivor of my wife and I to die, but I've completely avoided the probate fees and have delayed the taxation until we actually transfer the cottage in our estate. So a lot of people are creating that sort of thing because of that rollover. I think before you do really sophisticated planning, and this is sort of getting back to what we talked about earlier, think about your family. Does a trust make sense for your family? Where is your family? I think a lot of people do trust planning a little too early. And I'm going to give you an example if I can spend 1 minute before we go on to the next thing. And I want to talk to you about the case of Rose and Rose. It's a lawsuit that I think Eric knows because I think we've actually talked about it in the past when we met one time. Rose and Rose was a situation where there was a man named Brian Rose, and Brian Rose had done very well for himself. He had a cottage up north and he had a ski chalet in Collingwood and he had a great deal of assets. He met the love of his life, Wendy, and they got married and they had 2 children, Ashley and Kelsey. When Ashley was 9 and Kelsey was 7, Brian saw his financial advisors, his accountant and his lawyer, and they said, you know what, you might want to create a family trust. This isn't an alter ego or a joint partner trust, but there were reasons you might want to create a family trust. And you might want to move your cottage and your ski chalet into the trust. And that way, there's certain advantages for income splitting and a whole bunch of other things happen, and you'll avoid probate. So that's exactly what Brian did. I don't think he really understood what he was doing, but that's exactly what he did. The trust said the beneficiaries of the trust were his daughters, Ashley and Kelsey, and it named himself as trustee. And the family continued to live for a few more years just wonderfully. Well, a couple years after they created the trust, Brian and Wendy fell out of love. Apparently she wasn't the love of his life and they broke up. And it was a horrendously bad divorce. Brian was sitting one night in his bachelor apartment or wherever he was living now, and a knock came on the door and it was a process server. And the process server served him with papers that said, Brian, on behalf of your daughters, the beneficiaries of the trust, we want to advise you that you cannot enter the ski chalet or the cottage without their signed written permission because it's for their benefit. That's what the whole trust says. And we just want you to know that they are never, ever going to give you the right to go into those properties again. One of these properties, by the way, he owned before he got married, the cottage. And then secondly, they said, and we're also bringing an application to remove you as trustee because you're clearly in a conflict of interest with the rest of the family. Brian went to court and he said to the court, listen, I want to destroy the trust. I want to wind it up. There's nothing in the trust document that gives me the right to do that, but this is clearly not what we intended. This was done for tax purposes and succession planning purposes. Let's wind it up. Well, the court said, we don't wind up trust just because you don't like them anymore. You created it, you live with it, but we agree with your children that you can't enter it unless you get their permission. And we agree with the family that you're in a conflict of interest and you're not going to be the trustee anymore. Your family has suggested someone else who, by the way, was dating his ex-wife. He can be the trustee now. And so I think that's an example where tax planning and estate planning took priority over sitting down and saying, well, is this family really in a position to do this sort of planning at this particular time? But let's move on, because I know you guys want to talk about this and talk about putting assets into joint name. And I think it's a tremendously important topic to cover in the remaining time we have. I don't know how much detail to go into about the history of this whole thing, but basically in Ontario or in Canada, there are up to 3 different types of joint accounts. There was a case called Pecor in 2007, and what happened in Pecor in the quickest possible ways was there was a man named Mr. Hughes. Mr. Hughes had 3 daughters, but apparently he only liked one of them because he left everything to that one daughter. Her name was Paula. He had $950,000 in an investment account. He went to an investment advisor one day and he said, I want to put the account in a joint name with Paula. That way, when I die, Paula gets the money. Because the big thing about joint accounts is the right of survivorship. The person gets the money. He then wrote a will, and in his will he said, I'm going to divide my estate into 2. Half of it will go to Paula, and half of it will go to Paula's husband, Michael. Mr. Hughes then died. Nobody cared from an asset point of view whether Paula got the money as a survivor under the will or whether she got it because of the beneficiary designation. It didn't make any difference. But it made a big difference 2 years later because Michael and Paula got divorced. And Michael said, you know, if Paula got this because of the beneficiary designation, it's a gift. And I can't claim under the Family Law Act against a gift because there's exempt property. And one of those exempt properties is saying that if you divorce, anything you received as a gift and you've kept separate, your spouse can't claim against. So he said, darn, I can't get my hands on it. But if it didn't go through that joint account, the beneficiary designation, it goes through the will and I inherit half of it because I get half of everything. So they sued all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said there are 2 types of joint accounts. One is a true joint account, that joint account with right of survivorship. And we assume that if you put assets in joint name with your wife, that's what you intend. And then there's a new type of joint account in town, joint account for estate planning purposes. And in that joint account, we're assuming that if you put it into joint name with anyone else but your spouse, they're holding it in trust and it must be returned to your estate. And it really depends on which one of those joint accounts you're creating, the importance of it. Now, in the Paula situation in Pecor, the presumption, because Paula was not his wife, is that she's holding it, but it must be returned to the estate because that's the presumption. Now, Paula was able to lead tons of evidence that that's not what Dad intended, so she won the lawsuit because it's only a presumption. But the problem with putting your assets into joint name with your children is twofold. You better leave tons and tons of evidence as to what your intention was. Is it a true joint account with right of survivorship where the kid actually receives it when you pass away, that it transfers to them? Or is it one of these joint accounts which is for estate planning purposes only, and the child's only holding it to be returned to your estate and transferred through your estate and through your will? I have seen more and more families blow up over that determination. A few years ago, if you'll give me like 5 more minutes, I can probably finish this whole thing. Thanks, Eric. There was a case called Cook and Cook. And Cook and Cook shows the gritty nature of these things. And what happened in Cook and Cook was there was a guy called Mr. Cook and he had 5 children. His go-to kid was his oldest daughter. He only had 2 assets. He had $80,000 in a non-registered account and he had $6,000 in a bank account. That was it. He went to his bank and he put the $80,000 in joint name with his oldest daughter. He then died. In his will, he left everything to the 5 kids. His oldest daughter had the 5 kids over for coffee or cookies or whatever you do when someone passes away. And she said to them, I want you to know what Dad did. He had $80,000 in a joint account with me. So that's mine. I'm keeping it because I think Dad intended me to have it. Even with those crazy presumptions the Supreme Court came up with, I think I'm going to keep it. And you guys can sue me if you want to. And then there's $6,000 that is in his retail bank account. Now, you might think you get a bit of that, but I'm the executor and I'm going to take that as my executor fee. So you guys get 0 and I get $86,000. Enjoy the cookies and coffee. The children sued. A week at trial, 3 days in the Court of Appeal. Count the lawyers. Each one of those kids had a lawyer and the estate had a lawyer. That's 6 lawyers. How much of that $86,000 do you think was left at the end of the week and 3 days? Because if you think anything was left, I can show you a whole bunch of bills that would prove you wrong. But emotion took over. And that's one problem with putting assets in joint name. You've got to leave that roadmap of what you intended. Otherwise, there's a problem. The other thing with joint accounts that I'll mention really, really quickly is joint accounts can create immediate tax consequences. CRA says if it's a true joint account, one of those joint accounts where I really need my kids to have it, they have the right of survivorship, they're saying that at the time you put the asset in joint name, you should include half the value of that property, half the capital gain in your tax return in the year you create the joint account. I've never understood the joys of paying a tax now that I could avoid till I was dead, simply to avoid what in effect is probate at my death. And so I think those are really the big problems with that. Moving on really quickly, there's a few other things to keep in mind. The property will be subject to seizure by the new owner, by the new co-owner. If I put assets in a joint name with my son, and he racks up all sorts of gambling debts or whatever else there might be, my property is now partially his asset. He owns a portion of that, and it can be subject to his claims. And earlier we talked about the first-time home buyers program and all those other programs. Don't forget that. When you put assets in joint name with your children, think carefully about what they already have out there. It may be simpler just to retain ownership until death and transfer the cottage as part of your estate plan. Forget about all those fancy plannings. Might not be right for your family, might be. You'll still have that probate and that deemed disposition will apply, so you're going to have that big income thing, but at least then you get to control it. And we know it can be included as your principal residence throughout the entire period when you owned it, and we don't get into that subject about the children have 2 principal residences. There are 3 basic ways that you can do anything you want in your will. Your will could be just as complicated or easy as you want. It can have all sorts of stuff in it. But basically, when you're talking about a cottage, there are three ways of doing it. One, the cottage can be gifted to one or more of the children. So you could have had those conversations we started with, and now you could say, you know what, I'm going to gift it to the children now in my will, and it's going to go to these children. Think carefully about that tax burden and where the tax burden lies. Lies with the estate. So the kid gets the cottage free and clear. So you've got to do some drafting around there. Secondly, and the option I like a lot better, is create a right of first refusal. If one of your children has said, I want the cottage, say, well, you know what, I'm still going to divide my estate equally between my 2 children, but you have a right of first refusal to buy the cottage at fair market value with your inheritance. So you can take it as a portion of your inheritance. And lastly, some people like to create a testamentary trust. Say, you know what, my kids want to share ownership. I don't know if they can. So I'm going to create a trust and hold the cottage in trust for 5 years, say, or for 10 years, or whatever it is. And this is going to be a little bit of a test for my children to see if they can actually share it. I'm going to give them a time period to see if they can actually share it. And if they can't at the end of that period, it can be sold to any one of them. So the last thing we were going to talk about, and we'll do it incredibly quickly, is the legal complexities of cottage ownership. And I think there are 2 that are important to think about. One is transferring your cottage to your children, whether it's through joint accounts or gifting now or selling it to them, exposes the cottage to a claim by potential creditors. And so really you have to know your children well and know whether they have a whole bunch of creditors. I can think of a situation where if someone had a gambling debt, they transferred the cottage, half of the cottage to him, and before you know it, huge gambling debts were saying this guy has to pay these things. Here's an asset of his. We're going to claim against that asset. There's also other creditors out there, I'm sure, CRA, other types of liens. The other thing that you might want to think about is the legal complexities from disappearing spouses. Families change all the time. I have a daughter-in-law, love her to death, but I realize that someday she might realize she could do better than my son and she might leave the family. I know that 46% of marriages break down. So the chance is about 50% that the people you're dealing with now won't be your in-laws at the time you die. And this bothers a lot of people. They say, I want to make sure that the cottage stays within my family. Well, there's a couple things to know. One is, if a couple divorce under the Family Law Act of Ontario, they have to do an equalization of their assets, net family property calculation. But gifts and inheritances are exempt from that calculation. So if I gifted my cottage to my son or my daughter, that's exempt from that calculation, so long as they keep that separate and in their name. That's not the end of the story, though. In fact, it's a very simplistic version of that story, but it's not the end of the story. The Family Law Act defines something called a matrimonial home. A matrimonial home is every property, and I'm reading the definition here, in which a person has an interest, and that is or if the spouses have separated, was at the time of separation ordinarily occupied by the person and his spouse as a residence. That's a matrimonial home. So let's get rid of the legal mumbo jumbo. You have two houses, you live in the city for a couple months every year, you go up to the cottage for a couple months over the year. Both of those are matrimonial homes. Unlike the principal residence thing we talked about before, there's no limit to the number of matrimonial homes you can have, as long as you ordinarily reside in it as a couple at some point during the year. It's a matrimonial home. And why is that important? Well, a matrimonial home, regardless of whether it's an inheritance or not, is subject to an equalization on marriage breakdown. So I gift my cottage to my son Jack, or I put it in joint name or whatever else it might be, and I think, well, I'm safe because it's exempt from that equalization payment. Think again, because as long as it's a matrimonial home, my daughter-in-law, when she leaves the family, could make a claim against it. There are two ways around this. One is a marriage contract. Say to my son, you know what, I think you guys should have a marriage contract saying that if you break down, here's what's going to happen with the cottage. Careful with those, but you might want to do it. Or the other one is a matrimonial home designation. The law in Ontario says that if I designate one property, if my wife and I designate one property or more properties on titles, so when I registered the land, if I designate it as a matrimonial home, anything that's not designated cannot later be claimed to be a matrimonial home. So a lot of times when we're transferring cottages, people will say, I want my son and his wife to designate their house as a matrimonial home right on title, because then I know the cottage will no longer be one. So that's the end of our journey. I think I'm about 6 or 7 minutes over, so I apologize for that.
I just want one last point of clarity, and before you summarize, there is a spousal rollover in Ontario for tax purposes. Yep. Do both names have to be on the deed for that spousal rollover to take place, or does it not matter if one property is owned by one person or the other?
Yeah, so I didn't cover spousal rollover simply because I sort of thought we were talking about the next generation in planning, but Jeff is perfectly right. If I transfer property to my spouse, it transfers, if I wish it to transfer, it transfers on a rollover basis, and so there's no taxes. And a lot of planning goes around that issue. No, the property doesn't have to be solely jointly in my name with my spouse. It can be separate names and still be subject to that rollover.
Includes both the principal residence and any other, and a cottage, for instance?
Yep.
Okay, so but basically for those who are listening, if one of the two spouses dies, the properties and their assets will transfer to the spouse tax-free. And so there's no real tax consequences until the second spouse dies.
Exactly. Thanks. So I guess my summary is pretty short and pretty to the point. All I'm really saying is spend time as a family trying to figure out what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve. Try to figure out if you really can share the cottage and whether people are actually interested in sharing the cottage, or even if they're interested in receiving it at some point. You might be surprised by the answer. Understand the options and understand the tax consequences, not just the capital gain consequence, because that's an important one, but also think about the land transfer tax situation, because that's also important. Think about the down the road rules about principal residence and your children, and does that affect them to do transfer at this point? And consider the legal risks of any plan you put in place. Think about how you want to protect that family, that property in the future. And so there you go. I'm sorry I went a little overboard there.
Keith, there's one more thing.
Yep.
The shoebox theory.
What is the shoebox theory?
And that is simply put, if you own a cottage or another property, and you might be selling it down the road, which we generally do, then just keep your expenses, pay for your upgrades, your capital improvements, and keep those expenses and log them every single year, because at the end of the day, you'd be surprised at how much they add up and how much they can save you in tax. And so many people don't do it. And if you pay cash, remember that you don't get to add that expense down the road. Sierra doesn't accept cash without a receipt as a legitimate capital expense.
That's great advice, Jeff. And you're right. It's amazing how quickly it adds up. And it's amazing how important it is, because as I said earlier, CRA has said they will be auditing these accounts. So they're going to look for those receipts. So keep that shoebox handy.
So if you do pay cash, ask for a receipt.
Yep. Exactly.
And keep it in your shoebox.
Yeah, there you go.
Seinfeld used to do that. He used to come out with a huge box.
Oh, I remember that.
It's done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Keith, on behalf of Jeff Pear and the rest of the WWH team, I want to thank you for sharing this lunch hour with us. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge that you shared, a great presentation, and also brought a lot of color to some legal cases that can bog you down. So really appreciate you doing that and sharing that with us today.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and have a great summer at the cottages.
Wonderful. So get your tunes going. And just a note to everybody, thanks for participating. You will get every YouTube link in the next few days. If you missed anything, or if you want to watch it again or share it, that will be hitting your inboxes soon. So big thanks to everybody for attending. And if you have any other ideas for webinars, please feel free to reach out. We love putting these on for you. So wishing everybody a great rest of the summer. Thanks again, Keith, and enjoy the Cottage
Thanks,
playlist.
boys.
Thanks, guys.
Keith. Thanks, everybody, for joining.